Hey YouTube, Joeboy here. So, One Piece chapter 1153 is out. If you guys haven't checked out that chapter yet, I suggest that you do so because I will be spoiling you. But now that you have, let's begin. I have absolutely no idea how Oda consistently does this, but it's like he marinates flashbacks in crack. There's this thing people commonly say, I feel like they just say it and they don't really think about it, it's just a thing people say, that flashbacks are bad writing. If you have too many of them or they are too common, it disrupts the impact and the flow of the present events. But yeah, whoever started this is legitimately a moron. Maybe this is just created from my perspective reading fantasy. And nowadays, like if you get into any huge fantasy series, there's like half a dozen perspectives, POVs, and often these characters are not in the same place and doing the same thing. You can have almost like entirely different stories being told at the same time. But yeah, for me, that is almost exactly the same as how Oda uses flashbacks in One Piece. It's just another POV, except for set in the past. So all of this is really just antiquated thinking. Flashbacks and other POVs can absolutely be the highlight of a story if the story being told is compelling by itself. But yeah, I suppose this is just my long way of explaining why Flashback Piece is at least as good and, honestly, I think sometimes even better than the rest of One Piece. Oda tells incredible short stories. It may not have the highest highs of the culmination of huge arcs, but the bang for your buck chapter by chapter is incredible. It's elite, top tier. You can't beat it. Then you even take that to another level entirely because this great story by itself also becomes pivotal to understanding the larger story. And with One Piece specifically, I think that it's even more genius than that because One Piece is a story about the passage of time and how the present was made by the past. So frankly, I think you could flip this criticism around. There's a lot of stories where you just sort of dropped into a world with no context. What happened before the story began and what will happen after the story ends is mostly irrelevant, non-essential. I can make an argument that that is wasted space. But yeah, I can't exactly explain how Oda does it every single time. But as I was reading the chapter, man, even in the parts where I don't feel as though it should have hit me very hard. I mean, the whole thing from the very beginning had me an emotional mess, and I can't explain it. I really don't know. Maybe it's really as simple as Oda just does a fantastic job of setting it all up, preparing us for the inevitability of the flashback and getting us excited to see it. But anyway, this chapter was entirely flashback, and it began where the last chapter left off with King Harold as a bastard. King of Elbaf at 15. But yeah, what's really crazy about the flashback is all of this seemingly kind of justifies what my mindset has been about Harold essentially since we learned that he was a character. It might have taken me 20 years, but it just kind of feels like I'm thinking about the story in kind of the right way. One of those things that the community has been consistently discussing for a long time now, even before really we should have been discussing it, is whether or not King Harold was legitimately evil or not. Like, legitimately, it did not take very long for a very vocal segment of the community to start arguing that Loki did nothing wrong. We just felt like Loki was the good guy in this story, which is a thought that has panned out pretty well, I must say. But if you're thinking that Loki did nothing wrong and that he's the good guy, and we also kind of knew that Loki killed his father, King Harold, then, the next obvious question is, well, is Harold the bad guy? Or was he? So I think that those of you who watch all my chapter reactions, or at least most of them, I think can vouch for me here. I was pretty consistent. Where, yes, I thought Loki did nothing wrong. I thought Loki was the good guy, but I also didn't want to call Harold a bad guy either. Look, we were told that the country of Elbaf idolized Harold unlike anybody else. He fundamentally changed the nature of the country. Really, there's only two ways that you could have taken this. Either he was the kind of person that the country thought that he was, or he's a mastermind manipulator at an unprecedented level. So I'm going to collect my dub on this one. I think that reading this flashback leaves you with the very strong impression that Herald really was the kind of person Elbaf could look up to. He just didn't necessarily start off that way. But I suppose I do kind of want to explain my thought process beforehand. Guys, to me, it just seems to be the case that the deeper that we get into One Piece, the less One Piece becomes a story of black and white. Now granted, this may change with an in-game character such as Emo, but it feels as though Oda's philosophy with One Piece is the vast majority of the inhabitants of the world are good people at heart. Frankly, the more that I think about the story, even regarding characters that now, people don't have a very high opinion of, right? There's two things which define what makes somebody evil. Selfishness at the expense of others, and the philosophical truths that people believe in. As you get to know all characters a bit better, when it comes to those that people may define as evil, they fall into one of these two buckets. As just an example, there's a lot of people out there that like to believe that celestial dragons are evil. But the reality is that celestial dragons are raised and taught in an environment which preaches that they are better than. For them, this is some sort of worldly truth, which then leads them to inflict harm upon others. But then through the course of the story, you meet Homing, you meet Saint Mosgard, you learn that Corazon is a celestial dragon, you learn that Shanks is a celestial dragon by blood, and it's very obvious that celestial dragons are not evil people. Stereotypically, they simply see right and wrong differently. They believe a truth, which is probably by nature evil. But yeah, Oda overtly explores some of these ideas in ways that, it's clear that One Piece has an agenda. You can talk about Arlong and the fishmen. When they were first introduced, they believed that fishmen were inherently better than. Arlong's philosophy was exactly the same as the celestial dragons. But you obviously don't think about the fishmen in the same way that you would think about the celestial dragons. In my opinion, Oda effectively argues that whatever group has the most power will be preferential to its kin, especially if it's isolated from the rest of the world and other classes of people. Perhaps the character right now in the story which emphasizes this most is Loki himself. At this point, I think it's a pretty non-controversial thing to say that we all like Loki, right? And Loki doesn't seem like the bad guy to us at all. However, based on the things that he says and that he seemingly wants to believe and teach others, he's fully capable of slaughtering innocents, especially those that are not giants of Elbaf. I guess Loki essentially represents King Harold back when he was 15. His outright stated goal is to eventually one day destroy the world, which is exactly opposite to what King Harold wanted for most of his adult life. Destruction of anything would be a waste. So it's just clear that context matters, because for Loki, he likely wants to become Nika. He believes that Nika is this destined character that is going to change the world for the better. And, there's reasons why he wants to do it, in which he can believe in his own mind that he is not the bad guy. And characters in the story such as Luffy, or we as readers, can interact with him and leave with the impression that he is not the bad guy, while the truth that he upholds is fundamentally most likely evil. In my opinion, this is kind of the reason why Luffy doesn't go out of his way to kill all of his enemies, and oftentimes why many of his enemies end up becoming his allies, because One Piece conflict is often about ideology. It's about opposing beliefs. It's true that Luffy often wins fights through violence, but the end result is changing somebody's worldview. Essentially, One Piece as a story mostly assumes that people are good, but ideas can be bad. If someone, for whatever reason, believes themselves to be better than by nature, by birth, whatever the circumstance, Luffy is here to prove otherwise. Or on the flip side, if somebody subscribes to some sort of evil philosophy because they view it as a greater good, Luffy is also here to say, not so fast. I represent an even more obviously greater good that you discounted because you didn't believe. But I'm here to prove it's possible. And then, of course, you have the characters in the story through experience or whatever that have simply realized that the world is unfair and that the winners just take what it is that they want. Selfishness is the way of the world. Eat or be eaten. Trying to fight it is pointless. All that really matters is you. Luffy makes people question this as well, or at the very least provides hope where it may not have existed prior. He's simply incorruptible. Not even power can do it. Anyway, I feel like I've gone on a bit too long with this tangent, but the point is that I think about nearly every character in this way. If a character is destined to play an antagonistic role in the story, it's not because they're evil. It's because either they're selfish and they don't care about other people, and or they subscribe to some sort of philosophy which must be defeated. And I really struggled to see Harold in this way. Of course, his philosophy may have some flaws, but overall, it's a philosophy which I think is compatible with Luffy's, so long as a person like Luffy is there to fight your battles when needed. Maybe you want to scream at the top of your lungs, JB, Harold wanted to join the world government. That inherently makes him evil. But you know another character that wanted to do the very same thing? Queen Otohime from Fishman Island. But JB, it could have been true that Harold desired the power of the world government. And I'm over here like, isn't King Harold the king of the giants, which is supposedly the strongest race in the world, and the country of Elbaf is this kind of paradise? What power could Harold have? What power could have tempted a guy like King Harold enough to sell out his entire country for some sort of selfish reason? Maybe his goal was to become king of the world, but even as king of the world, you would want the giants on your side. Like, honestly, we are seeing that firsthand because this is precisely Emu and the government's perspective. Do you guys see why none of this really makes a whole lot of sense? If Harold really was this evil guy that wanted to become king of the world, it would have been much easier to simply convince the giants to go on a warpath, rather than attempt to preach peace and pacifism. But yeah, basically what I'm saying is that the more that I thought about it, the more difficult it was to try to imagine King Harold as an antagonist, as a bad guy. In the story of One Piece, this kind of character requires an Orochi or a Loki backstory. It requires you to have some reason to hate your country. But we already knew that Harold was beloved. For me, the ingredients simply were not there. So maybe it goes without saying that now that we actually have Harold's backstory, it makes a lot of sense to me. And despite our discussion to begin this video being so long-winded, I think that it's very relevant to understand what actually happened. We begin King Harold's story at 15, and the Giants of Elbaf collectively believe in a philosophy very similar to the Celestial Dragons. Harold is under the impression that he and the Giants are simply better than the other peoples of the world, and it's their right to do as they want. So Harold's actions at this age are bastardly, yes, but he's not a bad person. His beliefs simply needed to change. But in this case, it didn't require Luffy to defeat him in order to accomplish this. Instead, what was required was love and experience in the world, forging connections. I kind of hate making any review pure fellatio, but I am often so very glad that Oda is the one telling this story. It is so very interesting to me that One Piece as a story is designed to be absurd. That's the packaging. And for most people, that's what they gather from it. It's not meant to reflect reality. But the more that you read it and understand it, I think it becomes clear that One Piece is absurd in some very targeted way, and in many respects is meant to be realistic. It's meant to teach people truths about our actual world. Personally, I think that Oda understands people at an immensely deep level. He sees beyond how people act and understands why people act. This is a nuance that I think goes above a lot of people's heads. If you were to take one singular thing away from Harold's flashback, I think that it describes the power of love. Truly. It may seem corny to you to acknowledge this in such a straightforward way, but while Oda tells a story, he's also justifying how real this power is in a way that other people simply can't. So Harold is born in Elbaf, and he loves his country and he loves his friends. Because he loves his country and his friends, it leads him to become a warmonger like all of Elbaf's kings prior, probably. All of these raids are done across the world for the benefit of the country of Elbaf and the people that Harold loves. Violence was a means for Elbaf to prosper. This is also Elbaf's identity. He loves his country, therefore he loves his country's identity. Giants often talk about their pride in Elbaf. The source of this pride was love. No different than a parent having pride in their child. Elbaf is perfect and beautiful just the way that it is. So how do you break this delusion? In King Harold's case, it was finding something else that he loved, and for those two things to be at odds with each other. So he had to discover a way for his two loves to coexist, because that was what he wanted. So the giant warrior pirates are raiding as per usual. They stumble upon a random kingdom in the New World and discover a giant being held captive behind bars as part of a circus. Harold is clearly infuriated by this, and they destroy the entire country and save the giant, or so they think. But as it turns out, they didn't save this giant at all because she was a part of the circus willingly. That was, in fact, her job, and the people that ran the circus in the past had saved her from death. It's basically a different version of Sanji's backstory, with Zeph and the Baratier. So she literally slaps King Harold in the face and demands that they turn the ship around to fix the damage that they had caused. Ultimately, Harold does this because of his love for his people, or the giants, which Ida was, despite not actually being from Elbaf. So I'm sure that people already kind of like fundamentally understand this, but I want to be excruciatingly explicit because it's so important. You already know that at the end of the story, Luffy is going to save the world. And it's events like this in this flashback that are going to be used to justify and explain how Luffy eventually does this. But spoiler alert, the answer is love. The idea is that this becomes a sort of web of love. Harold eventually, or maybe instantly, falls in love with Ida. But to foster or protect this love, he must then also adopt the things that Ida already loves. So basically, because of this, Harold can no longer have an Elbaf-centric view of the world. And it encourages him to redefine what Elbaf is. Change its identity. But yeah, when I read this chapter, honestly, my first thought is Luffy, because what is happening in this chapter is a microcosm of Luffy's adventure. Luffy, we see Luffy in a very positive way. Luffy is the hero of the story, but he's not willing to sacrifice anything or everything for anybody. What happens in essentially every single arc is, one, Luffy wants to explore the world, stumbles upon an island, and then he makes a friend. Luffy will fight for his friends. But this doesn't necessarily mean that Luffy would fight for a country. This is why obtaining this friend is so important, because this friend has things that they love as well. I think that this is a good way to put into perspective how exponential the story of One Piece is. Luffy, when he began his adventure, had no intention whatsoever of saving the world. But eventually, this is what he will do. And the reason is for his friends, which he makes easily. So as he adventures, the world gets bigger. And with each friend from each island that he makes, the number of things that Luffy wants to protect increases exponentially, until he's suddenly fighting for the entire world. So I suppose, long story short, is Ida defeated Harold in ideological combat using love. And I think that this flashback also highlights the importance of adventure and exploration. In the beginning, Harold didn't have any respect for human society. It took some specific circumstances for him to realize that the humans had something to offer the giants in Elbaf. So as Harold fell in love with Ida, he also fell in love with this country's culture. Harold developed some form of pride in the random country of Bund, leading to the realization that, at least in some ways, the country of Elbaf could change for the better. It wasn't perfect as is. But yeah, this all began in the kingdom of Bund, but Ida continued traveling with the giant warrior pirates, and I would guess largely due to her influence, Harold was able to develop an appreciation for every island that he visited. Essentially, it's this process of Harold's coming to fully embrace the philosophy that destruction of anything in this world would be a waste. It's important to get to know all of these other nations because they all have something to offer the kingdom of Elbaf. However, the problem that Harold eventually encountered was all of Elbaf's past crimes and the ability of Elbaf to commit crimes in the future. Due to their reputation, the world largely did not trust them. And then at the same time, he started to encounter the problem of the world government. It's not explicitly explained, but from what we get, I kind of gather that Harold and Elbaf were not free to make inroads with the vast majority of the countries of the world because they were not a part of the world government. I imagine things like trade were restricted. So eventually Harold realized that the only way that this would work is if Elbaf joined the world government and made the people of Elbaf subservient to the celestial dragons, which I imagine was a tough sell. Maybe this conversation is boring to a lot of people, but I really feel like discussing it in this way makes you really understand what's happening. or what happened. I know I made this comparison a lot in the last chapter review, parallels between Sanji and the Vinsmoke family and the Elbaf royalty, but Harold's flaw, if he has one, is that he loves too much, or too easily. Something I definitely think that Loki has inherited, whether it was partially because of Ida or not. If you want to put yourself in Harold's mind, I think that you kind of have to see the world with rose-colored glasses. When he visited the other countries of the world, he didn't really see or acknowledge the bad. He really focused on the good and what those countries could offer to Elbaf. This is his bias. So I apply the same to the world government. Harold chose to see the good and not the bad. He was naive and too trusting, which is a quality that Luffy is often accused of. Harold's dream was basically to unite Elbaf with the rest of the world. However, the world government was an enemy in this. So there was two potential ways that Harold could deal with it. Either join the world government or destroy them. He clearly chose to join them because they convinced him that Elbaf would retain its sovereignty. But obviously, in retrospect, he was tricked, and his plan from the start should have been to destroy them. But I just want to make sure that you guys are skeptical of the specific things that I'm saying. Good or bad decisions, right and wrong here. A lot of this judgment is based off of what actually happened. Harold is too trusting because he was tricked, and that had consequences. But like we already said, Luffy is also very similar. You can definitely make the argument that Harold did nothing wrong and in fact did exactly what he should have done. He didn't act in fear because of the possibility of being betrayed and tricked. He chose to believe in a dream, no matter how improbable it might have been. One Piece constantly preaches to live without regrets, to do what you think is right regardless of the consequences, even if that consequence is death. Basically, it's okay to fail if your failure is because you are a good person, and a bad person exploited that. Really arguing from the perspective of what One Piece is seemingly trying to convey, Harold really only did one thing wrong. Destruction sometimes has a purpose. Violence is at least sometimes required. This is literally a battle shonen where Monkey D. Luffy, who fights people, is the main character. So just analyze what he does and you likely have Oda's idea for what should be happening. He is not saving the world through pacifism. Take yourself all the way back to chapter 1 and Shanks, who has inspired Luffy, and the moral with the bandit is essentially there's a time to fight and there is a time when not to. There's some nuance in it, while the Giants apparently have gravitated to the extremes on both sides. But anyway, guys, it goes without saying that I thoroughly enjoyed King Harold's story, and the impression I'm left with is Harold was actually one of the greatest people to have ever existed, one of the purest souls. Over the years, I've spent a lot of time talking about Joy Boy candidates in the story. Luffy is obviously Nika, right? But there are many other characters that share similarities with Luffy and likely Joy Boy in the past. And it seems to me as if Oda creates hypotheticals for the various ways in which somebody could be like Nika, could be like Joy Boy, but are missing something. Roger is a version of Joy Boy who came too soon, was simply born at the wrong time. Noland was a version of Joy Boy who was bound by the law. Dr. Herolook is a version of Joy Boy who is simply weak. Kaido is a version of Joy Boy who does not feel joy. You can go on down the list, but to me, Harold seems like a version of Joy Boy who chose not to fight. And I don't think that this is just true regarding Harold's version of foreign policy. We essentially know that King Harold fell in love with Ida, and eventually they had a child, Hyrutin. This was the woman that he loved. This is who he wanted to marry. But one thing that you'll notice about Luffy is that Luffy pretty much always does what he wants to. Oda's been absolutely embellishing that in Elbaf because Luffy, from damn near the start, has wanted to free Loki, and despite all of the criticism otherwise, he kind of got what he wanted, yeah? At the very least, you need a very good argument to convince Luffy to do something that he does not want to do. For the most part, he's described as a very selfish person. So the Elder Giants told King Harold that unfortunately we cannot recognize your marriage with Ida. Only pure bloods can be permitted within the royal family. And despite it not being what he wanted, Harold submitted to this authority. I do not believe that Luffy would have made that same decision. Basically, in the same circumstance, Luffy would have chosen to fight for what he wanted, if that was required. Honestly, I think that the specific way that Oda described this is very illuminating. Harold tells Ida, "Forgive me. All these issues boil down to culture, and our feelings alone won't change things." Harold philosophically subscribed to the idea that you change things with feeling, not with violence. And unfortunately, there were actual consequences to be had for not fighting. Harold was forced to abandon his actual marriage with Ida and instead have an official on-the-surface marriage with a woman named Estrid, whom he did not love. Also whom, it turned out, was a remarkably inferior queen to Ida. Honestly, this is the kind of stuff that for whatever reason makes me emotional, even though I'm not sure I should feel this way, but I do. Oda was stupidly intentional about all of this. There's a reason why you look at Ida and, just the way that she's drawn, her face and stuff, she seems very plain, where Estrid has a kind of regal beauty to her. But if you look at their souls, Ida is by far the more beautiful person. This is the kind of thing that makes you rethink about Loki falling in love with Lola, Like, we know Lola has a beautiful soul and is not necessarily physically ideal. Just another reminder of how similar Loki is to his father. And it's simultaneously almost a cruel twist of fate that Harold was able to have his love in Ida because, he could be a pure soul like her, whereas Lola rejected Loki. That quite honestly might be the greatest disrespect in the entirety of One Piece, because we only know of one person Lola has ever rejected, and it seems like she'll take just about anybody else. But let's explore this even further. Why is Ida so beautiful internally? And why is Estrid not? Again, it has a lot to do with love. We do not get one scene of Ida hating anything or anyone. It seems she just loves it all, except physical destruction and violence. Like, bro, how heartbreaking is it that even when Harold tells Ida that they can't actually be married, that their child must be considered a bastard, that Ida just like, okay, well, I'll find the good in that. That is so powerful and moving. I'm over here falling in love with Ida as well. Just realize how selfless she must have been to allow King Harold to bed another woman and have a child with another woman. So Ida approaches everything from the perspective of love. And foiled to this is Estrid, who approached everything from a perspective of fear. It is pretty interesting to me that Oda chose to make Estrid's baseline that of fear and not hate. The fear just becomes hate. Oda low-key saying something. But yeah, if you don't really understand why Estrid represents fear, just look into her worshipping of the energies. She told us that she is a student of the Earth Wind arts. And essentially, you could look at these energies as being her god. Another thing that I think that Oda in the story of One Piece is preaching here is that we should be listening to our souls, compassion, love should be our god. But for Estrid, everything was dictated by the energies. The energies as her god told her what not to do. The end result of all of this was living her entire life in fear. Rather than appeasing herself or her own soul, she was living to appease her gods, which were constantly threatening her and the people around her. So look guys, there is a reason why throughout the story, Luffy does not act based on fear, even when those fears may be rational, which is clearly not the case with Estrid. It's so easy to look at Estrid and her beliefs and feel sorry for her, right? Laugh at her potentially, because it's so absurd. But quite frankly, there were a lot of people in the One Piece community who sided with Zoro when he told Luffy to not go rescue Sanji from Whole Cake Island. The difference is that people saw Zoro's argument as being rational. I know some of you out there may hate hearing this, but this just makes you another version of Estrid. Although I don't particularly want to dunk on anyone because I'm definitely a part of this group. So long as you believe that there is some things that we should fear, that makes you not Luffy. But at the very least, I do hope that the vast majority of people who read this backstory and saw Estrid don't think of themselves as being quite as bad as her. She lived her life with an extreme amount of fear, and that fear turned into hate. In my opinion, it's conversations like this which allow you to better appreciate Usopp. Usopp clearly feels a lot of fear. He's constantly afraid. But it's not the fear itself which Oda intends on shaming. Usopp is the most human character of the Strats. He best represents everybody. Comparatively, we are all small and powerless, and there are many things which constantly threaten us. But despite feeling a lot of fear, Usopp does not allow himself to give into it. Fear does not dictate what Usopp does or believes. It doesn't have that kind of power over him. Fear is not his god. As an aside, guys, sometimes I don't like making chapter reviews like this because I just don't think that a lot of people vibe with analyzing One Piece to this level. You know, it's I feel like a lot of people are just gonna tune out. You know, JB's just talking or whatever. But I mean, I'm sitting here and we're still making the video in this way because of how important I think that it is. You can go all the way back to Skypiea, and Enel said verbatim, "God is fear." You may not actually want to consume One Piece in this way, but we're talking about what really matters. The entire story from damn near day one has been about Oda's argument that God is love and joy. These are the things which should rule us. Or at the very least, these are the things, if we embrace them, that will bring about the world that we all collectively want. And through One Piece, Oda also suggests that the things that we want, no matter how long it takes, will eventually come to be. Because it is the nature of humanity to manifest the things that we desire. We have that power. But anyway, Astrid eventually got pregnant with Loki. Loki was born, and she saw his eyes. Oda is so freaking good at this, but once again, we have a very subtle but impactful plot twist. We were all under the impression that Loki was blind. That may not actually be the case, because his eyes resemble a demon. This person ruled by fear was then afraid of her own child, so she ordered it to be killed, secretly throwing it down all the way from the sun realm to the underworld below. But as it would turn out, Loki is just born different. As literally a one-day-old child, Loki not only survives this fall, as a tiny baby, begins climbing back up the tree. Loki is the cat that came back. So look, I have a million things to say about this, and I feel like we've been detailed enough before now that I can just start just saying stuff. Look, it's very important that Loki, from the literal day that he was born, lived a life without love. This is one way in which you create evil. Again, I know that people have a very good impression of Loki, and it's the dichotomy here that Loki is just like his father. Potentially he loves more than everyone else, yet has never been loved. So it's just a fascinating circumstance. We probably would not like Loki at all if his nature wasn't so good. Although saying that Loki was never loved may not be entirely accurate, because you most likely had characters like Ida and King Harold in his life, and you would think because of their natures that they would have tried to love him. So I kind of suspect in the next chapter of this flashback, we will find out that Ida probably ends up dying as Loki is a child. And this will most likely have an effect on King Harold. I just have a strong feeling that this is the direction that the story is going to go. Another thing that people commonly say is that you can't really and truly love others unless you love yourself, or you yourself are happy. So King Harold loses Ida, he is no longer happy, and that would probably have some influence in Loki, or Loki would understand this to some degree. It could even work out that Ida dies, and Harold takes it upon himself to cherish Hyriden all the more for it. Like Hyriden is a little piece of her, which still remains. And it just simply wouldn't be the same with Astrid and Loki, it just wouldn't be. Anyway, the whole point is that no matter how much Loki was actually loved, it would probably not seem like enough to him. And that is stupidly sad. I've never wanted more closure between the island of Elbaf and Loki than I do right now. And you already know that that's where the story is going, right? The entire island believed that Loki was prophesized to kill King Harold. Then, essentially he does do that. And, it's just the truth of everything that happened is going to come to light. And Luffy is going to play a big part in that. And fostering this reconciliation is just something I'm desperate for. I keep saying that Oda writes on a different level, but guys, he just does. I mean, like, I can't speak anything other than how I honestly feel. If you go back in this very same chapter, King Harold is concerned with reconciliation between the country of Elbaf and the rest of the world. He says, up until now, we've committed countless sins, and it's time that we atone for them. It is not a coincidence that in the following chapters, we are going to learn how Elbaf has committed countless sins against Loki. Harold's perspective was it wasn't the rest of the world's fault that they were afraid of Elbaf. This was Elbaf's fault. Likewise, I tend to think that it is not Loki's fault that he ended up who he is. Elbaf is responsible for this as well. All caused because they worshipped the wrong gods and followed wrong philosophies. Loki is here right now, and we like him despite all of the things which were pitted against him. Quite frankly, he isn't just a freak because of the strength of his body. The strength of his soul is just as noteworthy. But anyway, I want to make sure to talk about his eyes, because the theory that we had from the last few chapters, maybe it was just the last chapter, I'm not entirely sure. But the theory is that the giants of Elbaf have demonic forms because they were transformed into demons, literally into demons, either by Emu in the past or by somebody who had Emu's abilities. There's actually no such thing as ancient giant blood, or if that is a thing, it's simply because they were transformed into demons, and then as generations passed, right, the ancient giants would have had relationships with regular giants, and so the purity of this blood is slowly lost over time. A really cool theory that has been brought up to me is we never actually get to see Doflamingo's eyes, and it's possible that Doflamingo was born with these demon eyes, the very same as Loki. Or I suppose more accurately, demon eye, because we've seen his right eye. The eye that Oda, for whatever reason, never decided to show us was his left. This is one of those theories that some people absolutely hate because it's so speculative, and I guess they just don't see the potential in it. And I'm just going to tell you guys, I find this theory to be likely. I really do think that Doflamingo had one demon eye. And this comes from my general mindset that Oda always has a reason to do everything. There's a reason for everything. Contextually, it's just very obvious that Doflamingo is afraid to show his eyes. And you don't just wear sunglasses every minute of every day for your entire life for no reason. Anyway, we know that Emu had a relationship with the 20 kings back during the Void Century. Ultimately, the 20 kings served Emu. So it's perhaps likely that the 20 kings were transformed into demons. No different than the God's Knights or the Gorosei. They may look relatively normal on the surface, but they made a deal and they became demons. So this starts to create a relationship between the giants of Elbaf and the celestial dragons. Both possess the blood of demons, and therefore both have the potential to produce a child with demon features, including a demon eye. This also works incredibly well based on the culture of Elbaf and the culture of the celestial dragons, which we've already pointed out, at least before Harold, were essentially the same. They each believe themselves to be better than, and what harm they inflict upon others is their right. Also, I kind of imagine that just the same as it is important to be pure blood in the country of Elbaf, at least if you want to be Elbaf's king, something similar is present in Mary Joie with the celestial dragons. Aside from Bonnie, I don't think that we have officially met a celestial dragon bastard, but I would imagine that celestial dragons would see a child like this as being lesser than. But anyway, the flashback so far has been absolutely incredible, and I think what helps in all of this is a story that is literally straight from mythology. You guys felt it, right? As you read it, Loki is born from day one, is already incredibly strong, thrown from the top of Elbaf tree, climbs back up. Like, that feels like some kind of actual myth, because it is. It's the actual story of the Greek god Hephaestus. Essentially, Hephaestus was born to the queen of the gods, Hera, and in many interpretations, his father is the king of the gods, Zeus. However, Hephaestus was born with some kind of physical deformity that didn't align with Hera's conception of how gods should be. So she literally threw him from the top of Mount Olympus to the world below. And if you're just curious, Hephaestus was also the god of fire and the god of the forge. He was commonly depicted using a hammer, which fits pretty well with Loki. Basically, what he was most famous for, aside from his origin story with his mother, is he ended up crafting many of the powerful magical objects in Greek mythology. But if you dig a little bit deeper, I think that it's pretty clear why Oda was inspired to base Loki's backstory off of Hephaestus. And that's because there's a lot of similarity between Hephaestus's backstory and things relating to Loki from Norse mythology. In Norse mythology, Loki married a giant whose name literally translates as she who brings misfortune. Together, they had 3 deformed children: Fenrir, Jormungandr, and Hel. If you're not aware, Fenrir was a wolf, Jormungandr is the world snake, and Hel is a guardian of the underworld. Long story short is Asgard banished all 3 of Loki's children because 1, they were deformed and they didn't represent the gods, and 2, because of prophecies relating to future misfortune they will bring. And the irony is that their banishment of these children likely brought about the future that they were banished for. The irony is killing me. So at the very same time that Oda cooks us up such a compelling backstory and integrates all of this compelling philosophy, he is also drawing upon actual mythology in intricate ways on another level. Also, if you're wondering, this also relates to the 8-legged horse that just randomly showed up in the middle of the chapter, so yeah. But anyway, guys, I really feel like we said what needed to be said from this chapter, regardless of whether it was preachy and annoying. Just to be 100 with you, I think that a lot of these ideas that we expressed very explicitly in this chapter review are just better received when it's a subtle part of a story that you can enjoy for completely different reasons. Also, it should be worth pointing out that one of the best parts of stories is their subjectiveness, right? Like, you can read it, many people can read it, and have totally different interpretations from it. So to present any one interpretation as like, this is definitely how it is at the very least very annoying. And not really how what I consider to be good stories are intended to be consumed. So if you can't tell, I'm kind of internally fighting about whether or not I actually should be discussing One Piece like this. The whole thing is honestly, in part, mind-blowingly fitting because One Piece also explores the power of desire. Basically, this is clearly how I want to discuss One Piece. So what I want is actually driving me, even when I know that it's not necessarily the best thing to do, or that I'm being selfish by potentially taking away some of the subjectivity which makes stories great. The layers, man. As a side note, I had a conversation recently, and I've seen throughout the years that a lot of people think that One Piece politically argues for something like communism or socialism. And, you know, like a lot of people, I think, like seeing One Piece in a way that suits their worldview, whatever that might be. So this is a very similar conversation. So always remember to think for yourself, realize that I could be the one that is biased, and interpret One Piece how it makes sense to you. So long as you enjoy it, that is all that really matters. And by God, guys, right now I'm loving it. Absolutely peak One Piece. But yeah, I guess the only other thing that we didn't discuss is the semi-reveal that the red line is the giant serpent soaked in blood, which was referred to actually 1,000 chapters ago in the Little Garden arc. Long story short is one of the first theories that I ever made was that what Dory and Brogy were referring to in that arc was the red line, and that looks to be correct as well. So I'm having a good week. But as always, curious as to what you guys think, whether you noticed something from the chapter that I might have missed, just share your thoughts. If you're interested, check out my book, The Booms, link is in the description. Like the video, subscribe, click the bell to be notified, join the squad. And as always, guys, have a wonderful day.